Welcome to ICMD webinars. I am Dr. Santosh Matthew, training coordinator of International Christian Medical and Dental Association. I'm stepping in for Peter, who is the CEO, who is currently away on leave. ICMD brings together over 60,000 Christian dentists and doctors in over 80 countries worldwide. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Jim Ritchie speaking on the subject boundaries for healthcare missionaries. Jim is an emergency physician. He served 25 years in the US Navy, including 7 years as a residency program director and 2 deployments in Afghanistan. He then served for 6 years as a medical missionary in Kenya and helped start a family medicine residency there. Throughout his experience in combat medicine and mission medicine, Jim has engaged problems of moral injury and burnout and enjoys teaching the importance of boundaries. He currently works with Medicine in the Longevity Project, helping healthcare missionaries thrive. Jim and his wonderful wife, Martha, have 6 children and 1 daughter-in-law. They live in Virginia Beach. He's going to talk to us about boundaries for healthcare missionaries. The strategy for healthcare missions is profoundly effective, but inherent in the practice of healthcare missions is a propensity for overwork, burnout, and moral injury. These 3 factors are among the most frequently reported reasons for an early end of service for missionaries. The use of God-honoring boundaries have been identified as an essential spiritual discipline in cross-cultural missions. In this webinar, we will explore the biblical support for practicing boundaries, and Jim will describe practical examples of boundaries which healthcare missionaries have successfully employed. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. Over to you for sharing your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Santosh, very much. I really appreciate the ministry of ICMDA, in particular the webinars. I've been just very grateful to be able to watch so many of those webinars, and probably seen half of them at least. And so with the webinars, I really have appreciated those. I've appreciated so much to be able to learn from them, and it really has been a treasure. I appreciate the opportunity to add this topic of boundaries to prevent burnout to a wonderful list that is already there, outstanding topics. So these days I work with MedSend, and MedSend is an organization that interfaces with about 40 different mission agencies around the world. And so we have a little bit of a different vantage point to be able to see what's happening. And we've found that the most common preventable reason that healthcare missionaries leave the field before they had intended to is because of burnout from overwork. The missionaries feel that they just can't give themselves permission to have boundaries, or maybe they're not given opportunity to have boundaries by their organization or hospital or even their teammates. On the other hand, we also find some missionaries who are thriving in the field, doing well for a long period of time. And we found that most of them have figured out a way to have boundaries, to give themselves permission to have a more biblical understanding of boundaries. And so they're able to thrive. And it's really no surprise that that boundaries are a significant issue, because we have a built-in dilemma. I mean, when we go to do healthcare missions, we're going to places of great need. And often we are the only ones who are able to provide most of the need that's going on there, at least from a medical perspective. So a difficulty with boundaries is is a relative given. You might even ask yourself, is it a Christian thing to have boundaries? Because didn't Jesus say to love your neighbor as yourself? Well, talking with a surgeon the other day, she had gone with her family to a very needy place and was the only surgeon for 100 miles in any direction. When she had gone, she and her family had said, okay, we will have boundaries, but you know how it is. I mean, they didn't really have structured boundaries, but they had committed to having them. But so, for instance, she would say, all right, we will observe Sabbath on Sunday, but then that meant that after church, you go and do some rounds, and then the rounds, they turn into longer rounds, and you find surgical complications that you need to operate on. And so they turned around at one point, and there had been months since she had had a day off. And when they came home after the first term, they were miserable, the family were unhappy, and she was very burnt out. So this is a very typical story. What I hope to show, though, is that it's not only Christian to have boundaries, it's actually deeply faithful and God-honoring to have boundaries. So we'll talk about a biblical understanding of boundaries, and then we'll talk about some specific ways that people have found to have boundaries as a healthcare missionary on the field. And then we'll spend some time talking about the important topic of team mutually supported boundaries. And I'd like to show that the management of God-honoring boundaries is an essential spiritual discipline in cross-cultural missions. Now, Townsend and Cloud wrote books and have spoken widely about the idea of interpersonal boundaries, and I like one of their illustrations. They say that healthy boundaries are not like this. They are not a stone wall with barbed wire on top, separating people from each other and keeping everyone at distance. They are not like that. And healthy boundaries are also not like this. They're not like a line in the sand easily crossed with impunity. And instead, healthy boundaries are more like this, which is a lovely hedge with a gate. And you are in charge of your gate. You decide when it's open and when it's closed. For instance, my wife homeschooled when we were at this house. This was our house in Chiguria. And when she was homeschooling, the gate was closed. It meant that if someone wanted to visit, they could come back at some other time. Most of the time, the gate was open. But that's a more healthy picture of a boundary. Boundaries are solidly biblical. Yes, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. But also there are many examples of boundaries where people that we love from the Bible showed that they recognized their own limitations and recognized God's sovereignty at the same time. And one of my favorite examples is Moses. When Moses was with the Israelites in the desert, in the wilderness, he was obviously the best judge, right? He had spent time with the Lord. He had seen him face to face. He was the lawgiver. But when Moses and Jethro came to visit, he said, basically, what do you do? You are acting as judge all day, from morning to night. You're wearing yourself out. You're wearing the people out. This is not good. And Jethro taught Moses how to delegate, how to have boundaries, how to say, these are the things that I am responsible for, and I'm delegating other responsibilities to other people who may not be as capable, but we'll train them and they will learn how to do things. That's a good example of a boundary practice in the Old Testament. So that's the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Is there something that's different about that? Really, is it Christian to have boundaries that may separate you from other people's needs? Well, I would suggest that our best example would be found in Jesus himself. Jesus had boundaries. He absolutely worked hard. He healed. At times, he healed entire villages. Obviously, that took a lot of effort. If power went out from him when the bleeding woman had touched him, surely healing an entire village required a lot of strength, a lot of power. But that was one of his priorities. He had other priorities as well. And when the time came, he even would dismiss the crowds and send them away. And when the crowds wouldn't leave, he would get in a boat and go to the other side of the lake to distance himself from those people and those needs because he had other priorities. There are times when he would slip away by himself to go pray, to be away from those other needs, to reconnect with the Lord. So Jesus absolutely used boundaries. And so if the Lord, who could heal anyone and everyone, if he had boundaries, then unless we think we are somehow better than him or our healing ministry is more important than his, unless we think we are super Jesus, maybe we should also observe boundaries. Another clear biblical boundary is that of Sabbath. For 6 days you will rest, and on the seventh day you will separate yourself from that. And so rest is an important facet of Sabbath that we're supposed to engage in, but that's not the only one. It's also a time for reconnection with the Lord, of dedicated time with him to worship and lament and regather and recenter ourselves with him. And also, it is a time for us to recognize our own limitations, that we cannot work without stopping. And also to recognize God's sovereignty, that he really is in charge of life and death. He says so quite clearly in scriptures. And so Sabbath, us removing ourselves from the work, is a recognition that actually he is the great physician and we just work for him. Now you might say, didn't Jesus heal on the Sabbath though? And didn't he say, suppose your child or ox fell into the ditch on the Sabbath, wouldn't you immediately pull it out? And of course he did. But does that imply that Sabbath doesn't apply to us as medics? Because don't we, isn't there often an ox in a ditch? Isn't this, what was this Jesus's regular practice? And I think if we look at the breadth of the Gospels, we'll see that it wasn't his regular practice. Actually, we are told by Luke that Jesus routinely observed Sabbath, and we see throughout the Gospels that Jesus would teach in the synagogues as he was traveling. He routinely observed Sabbath. He did heal on the Sabbath. He healed 7 times in the Gospels that we see. But I would submit that if we look at the context of those healings, we'll find that they were almost all when they're clearly defined as he was engaged in appropriate Sabbath activities. In 3 of them, he was in synagogue teaching, observing the Sabbath. In 2 other ones, he was in an appropriate Sabbath meal. In another one, he was in Jerusalem for a biblical feast. And there's only one in which we don't have a specific context. So if it's appropriate to do math, here were 7 that we find over a 3-year ministry. So that would be on average 2 or 3 Sabbath healings in a year. Now, could there have been others? Sure, there could have been others, but many of these are repeated in the Gospels. They appear to be fairly, unique events. What we do not see in these accounts is Jesus healing crowds on the Sabbath. We see these individual situations in which he was demonstrating to the Pharisees that their legalism was not appropriate. And what we don't see is him healing crowds. As a matter of fact, Mark and Luke make that distinction quite clear, that after Jesus had healed Peter's mother-in-law on the Sabbath, when evening came, when the Sabbath was over, then the crowds came and Jesus healed them. So when Jesus talks about healing an ox in a ditch, he is not ox in a ditch service. Sabbath is not appropriate and we don't need to do that. That's not his idea at all. It was an individual, periodic demonstration of the importance of having compassion. Now, there are some other biblical verses that at times have been interpreted as supporting, a lot of physical endurance, superhuman physical endurance. For instance, Isaiah 41, we hear about a lot. Those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength, mount up with wings like eagles, run and not get tired, walk and not become weary. Also, we see from Paul in Philippians, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So do those verses imply that faith can give us superhuman physical endurance so that we don't need boundaries? And I would submit that actually those are not accurate interpretations of those verses, really. Isaiah is a beautiful verse. It's highly metaphorical poetry. These are metaphors, and it's using the metaphor of physical endurance to describe what it is like to be able to hope in the Lord for a long period of time. I personally know a lot of quite godly people, and I don't know anyone who has sprouted wings from their shoulders. I don't know anyone who can run and not get tired. We're not given superhuman endurance from this. Similarly with Philippians, Paul wrote that from jail. He did not bend the bars. He didn't escape. What he was talking about in Philippians was he had learned how to be content in all circumstances, not how to be superhuman. So I would submit that boundaries are solidly biblical. Moses, Jesus, Paul, there are clear examples that boundaries are appropriate and are actually God-honoring, recognizing God's sovereignty and recognizing our own God-given limitations. And so maybe we can consider some other concepts that support the idea of boundaries. One of them is that of mass casualty. The definition of a mass casualty is a situation, usually acutely, when a large number of patients come and their needs are beyond the ability of available resources or available personnel. So a bus crashes outside the hospital and now 40 injured people show up. Okay, so you have to triage. You have to decide, who are we taking care of first. We may be setting some people aside so that we can take care of more people that we're more likely to be able to save. It requires difficult decisions, and generally those decisions are not popular. It may be difficult for us to feel difficult for us to make those decisions. I would submit that often in the places where we're practicing in healthcare missions, it could be thought of as an ongoing mass casualty, where the needs always supersede the ability of the facility or the individuals to meet the standard of care in taking care of those people. So difficult decisions about triage: who will we be able to take care of, who will we not be able to take care of. Actually having, perhaps we would have to expend too many resources on this individual so that instead we'll be able to take care of more people this way. And those decisions can be very difficult and they can be unpopular, but they still fit the situation. They make it more available to make us more able to take care of more patients, and have another concept is the idea of changing our focus and where our mind to go as we're taking care of numbers of patients. If we have a queue of patients who come and we see everyone in the queue, then it's like this green line. We saw everybody and we feel good. What happens when this occurs? What happens in our minds? Let's say the green patients are the ones that we are able to see and the yellow patients are the ones that we were not able to see. Where does our mind go? What do we fret about? And we tend to think more about the patients who we were not able to see. And we don't really recognize, we tend not to recognize the work that we were able to do. And this is a demonstrable psychological phenomenon. It really is something that happens with regularity. So if we push ourselves to see the rest of those beyond, reasonable work hours, if you will, what happens when the ratio looks like this, or when the ratio looks like this? And we are able to take care of some patients, but there are just so many that we're not able to take care of. If we continue to push ourselves to see everyone that's there, and we're not able to focus on the good work we have been able to do that the Lord has set us up for, if we're not able to trust the Lord with the other people who we were not able to see, then burnout is virtually guaranteed. And then the line will look like this, in which we will be away from the work entirely. So being able to focus on the good work we have been able to see, the lives we have been able to help, can really give us some peace of mind with boundaries. Another concept is one that I learned in the military. We talked about it often, and that's balancing personnel and mission. There are times when the mission is critically important. All right. So for instance, with the military, again, if you have a platoon of soldiers and they're told, take that hill at all costs, and those soldiers then charge that hill to take the hill, we know that there will be casualties. But the mission is so important that if we don't take that hill, then the battle may be lost, the army may be lost, that sort of thing. You must take that hill. That's elevating the mission, and the mission becomes so much more important than the personnel, that sort of thing is justified. But you can't keep doing something like that. The attrition rate is too high. Instead, most of the time you need to elevate the importance of personnel, because in order to carry out the mission, you have to recruit and train and clothe and house and feed and lead these people and bind them into a unit so that they will be able to execute the mission. And most of the time there's some sort of a balance that goes on, especially in medicine, where we're looking after the needs of the personnel. People need to have rest, and the mission is ongoing at the same time. There are times when the mission needs to be elevated, and there are times when personnel need to be elevated and the mission needs to be subordinated to some degree. And then an important question to ask ourselves is, who are we towards our team, towards our coworkers? Do we really understand the importance of, at times, subordinating the mission in order to be sure that we have the personnel to carry out the mission longitudinally? And another, a similar question is, how are we towards ourselves? Are we willing to subordinate the mission so that we can take care of ourselves so that we can execute the mission tomorrow? Another useful concept is from my friend Stan Haggard. And Stan points out that when you say yes to an opportunity to do something, because we are limited beings, we are saying no to something else. Also, when we say no to an opportunity that is offered us, that means we are available to say yes to other opportunities that may be very high priority to us. And I think especially in family or relationship dynamics, this becomes quite important. A place where we've seen this play out in families is that families with children, the children, after a while, come to recognize this dynamic just inherently. And they realize that if we're always saying no to them because we've said yes to the patients, we have made an overt choice. And that can lead to some disappointment and some pain. And by the time the kids are teenagers and young adults and can really express that pain, it really can be an unpleasant thing. So I would submit that it is important to say no to some things offered to us so that we can say yes to some of our other responsibilities or relationships. So those are some concepts, biblical and non-biblical, that we can use to understand the importance of boundaries. And maybe we can look at some specific boundaries now. One of the first is that we need to understand that in order to have functional boundaries, they really need to be structured. Just saying, I want to have boundaries and leaving it nebulous, that tends not to work out. It's important instead to have schedules or rules to say, this is what I will do and this is what I will not be able to do. For instance, there are some medical services that truly are ox in a ditch services. I'm an emergency physician. The emergency department, casualty, A&E, it is an ox in the ditch service, right? There's always an ox in a ditch there. Same sort of thing can happen with hospitalists. And so with these services, we've learned you have to have shifts with end times. You know when you start and you know roughly when you're going to stop. And also when you stop, it's important to have a structure for turning over patients. Now, you might not be turning them over to someone who has your same abilities, but it is important to be able to delegate that or turn those patients over. And also it's important to turn off your pager or limit other access in order for these shift times to actually be functional, to give us the time away that we need. Another useful boundary might be a literal fence, because in some places where we serve, our houses may be open for people to come to ask for a variety of things, or even just for open social gatherings. Again, we had a fence with a gate and we used it. We found it to be very helpful. Sometimes that can be useful. Some healthcare missionaries have found it useful to hire a guard or someone to be at the entrance to their housing area to redirect people if they want to come and it's not an appropriate time, to redirect them more towards either another location or another time, or help them understand the situation. I was talking with someone who worked in a culture where it truly was offensive to other people if you turned them away from your house when they came to your house. But what they found that they could build an antechamber onto the front of their house, and they hired someone to take care of people in the antechamber, to make tea and offer snacks and those sorts of things. And that was acceptable. People were still received in the house, even if the family were in the back and not really in the middle of the relationships there. Now, are some of these ideas countercultural? Yes, they are. But I would submit that Jesus was countercultural too. And he was confident with his boundaries. And I think we can follow suit. We can be kind, we can be welcoming, but we also need to maintain the priorities of our families, our rest, our boundaries, our Sabbath. Another useful boundary is to engage trainees. Training people to do the work that we've gone over to to perform is a wonderful way of sharing and multiplying ourselves. This is a picture of some of our outstanding family medicine residents in Chagorria, and Eli Horn, my friend there, who's the residency director there now. Wonderful souls, love them, miss them. But giving responsibility to trainees and allowing them to have autonomy really is a great thing. It allows them to grow as professionals. If we are helicopter faculty, hovering over them all the time to be sure that they don't make any mistakes or that everything goes exactly right, that really doesn't give them the responsibility or autonomy. And also we need to model balance to these trainees so that they understand that they're not expected to always be present for the rest of their professional careers. How can we appropriately take care of our patients and delegate and have responsibility going to them, but also be able to rest? Sometimes when we had visitors come to our place, they felt like they needed to be helicopter faculty and always be present. So I would use this phrase: we need to prepare this junior clinician to competently and confidently practice independently. So it's important for us not to always be present and hovering over them. But with this delegation to the trainees, it's also important to ensure that they have opportunity for Sabbath as well, that we don't just model balance, but we give them opportunity to have balance. Another useful practice is that of hiring help. Administrative help is often quite welcome. Many of our administrative duties do not require a medical professional to carry them out. And often where we're working, there are capable people who want opportunities for employment, for growth, for training. So we can take advantage of that. And some possibilities for hiring help might be preparing lessons like PowerPoint slides or putting together the projector screens, that sort of thing, printing out materials, chasing laboratory tests for us so we don't have to spend our time finding out where the pathology results, contacting patients in follow-up, acting as a scribe with chart data entry or reviewing charts for research projects. We can hire people to do these things and allow us to have some more effective boundaries. Another means is to actively manage our schedule. And in thinking through how do we schedule ourselves, it's important to ask which paradigm dominates, the workload or what we are able to sustainably contribute. In other words, is the work that we're going to do today determined by who happens to show up or whatever work happens to appear? Or are we going to be able to say, here is how much work I can sustainably carry out over the long term, and we're going to get as much done out of that opportunity as we possibly can? And this is similar to the locus of control question. Is your locus of control internal? Are you making decisions about yourself? Or are other people making decisions about you that affect you, even though they may have no idea what your life is really like? A number of locations have found this schedule to be sustainable, and that is to have 5 work days, 4 clinical work days, and another work day that is not clinical to do all the other duties that are necessary, like preparing lectures, communicating with supporters, serving on committees, writing, going to immigrations, dealing with licensure and work permits, maintaining medical expertise, carrying on correspondence, preparing for agencies, liaison with other agencies, things like that. And a lot of places have realized that 1 weekend on call out of every month is about as often as can be sustainably maintained. So it's not a rule, it's just something that some people have found to be important. Another suggestion is to actively manage one's queue. Open-ended queues have been described as the devil's playground. They really are. They can really adversely affect morale, both of the staff and of the patients. So having an end to the queue, or saying that here's how many people we can see in a day, is a very reasonable thing to do. It's done all over the world. It can be done in other places as well. It's important for the people providing the care to not really be the gatekeeper, though, or this tends not to work very well. You can also manage the queue of ward rounds. Some missionaries have tried to set it up so that every patient is seen by a consultant or an attending every single day. And that may be quite unnecessary. At our had to finish rounds because for external reasons, we had to finish our rounds by 1 o'clock every day. So we would see the new patients, we would see the patients with abnormal vital signs, or the attending would, the interns and the residents would have seen everyone. But the attending would see new patients, people with abnormal vital signs, or people who we hadn't seen in a week or so. And those tended to be the ones who were important, and otherwise we delegated the ongoing care to the rest of the team. You can also, in a similar way, manage meetings and administrative duties and say, here's the number of hours or the number of meetings or administrative, that this is the maximum number that we're able to do. Let's pick the ones that are most effective or most important. Do we really need to have a blood bank committee? Do we really need to have 2 people, 2 clinicians serving on the needy patient fund, that sort of thing? But in limiting these things, I think it's important that we not just do it individual. It's important to coordinate with the rest of the team, to meet with the medical director and meet with the rest of the team and ask, how shall we prioritize these decisions? Another strategy is to leave the area. Sometimes it's hard to have a boundary in the area, and it's important to just get away from there. Jesus did that. He would go to the other side of the sea. He would slip off by himself. And for whatever reason, he liked to use the idea of boats to dismiss the crowd, send them away. Again, some of those people had traveled for days to see him, but when it was time to go, when the priorities were that way, he would leave in the boats. And so a good question is, what will be your boat? A final major concept is the idea that boundaries themselves need boundaries. If we have so many boundaries that we're failing to form mutually supportive relationships, that's not a good thing. There can be too many boundaries. We need to have the gate open at times. And actually, when one individual or just a few individuals on a team have boundaries, those boundaries tend to be fractious for the team. And it's important otherwise to have unity in the team. Unity is crucial. The Bible emphasizes unity among believers. And so in developing our boundaries, we really need to maintain unity. Our Christian lives are all about that. So we can negotiate shared boundaries among the team that can be very supportive to each other. And some examples of this, there's a team I know of where they really do support each other. And at one point they had one surgeon and little prospect for others. And they said, we protect our surgeon when he's been, and they knew that if left to his own decisions, he would work all the time and he would burn out if he were left to his own decisions. So after he had been up operating all night, they would take away his phone and let him go to sleep. And so if someone called and wanted to transfer a patient into the hospital, they would make the decision for their fellow, the surgeon. They would decide whether the patient needed to be received by the hospital, and if so, they would take care of him until he had appropriate rest, or whether that patient really shouldn't be transferred to their hospital. They would also bundle up this surgeon and his family and send them away for long weekends, at least every other month. Because when that happened, they didn't have a surgeon, but they knew that if they didn't do something at this point, they wouldn't have a surgeon at all. Some other ways we can support each other is to give each other permission to delegate, so that we don't have to see every patient on the ward every day. We can write each other's schedules so that we're not tending to overwork ourselves. When the wards are overfull, we can re-triage and decide which patients really are safe to go home, even though they may not have completed a full antibiotic course, that sort of thing. We can cover for each other in other ways, and one of everyone's favorite, cut non-vital admin for each other. So if you want to make a missionary happy, cut a committee away from their responsibilities. So how can our teammates protect us? We can ask that question and share that with them. And it's also important to ask, how can we take care of each other? How can we make boats for each other? An example of what not to do, there are some missionaries who have been serving for a long time with some small boundaries or not a lot of boundaries. It's not a great idea to go to those people and tell them how wrong-headed they are about that situation. It's not a wrong-headed situation. They have been serving the Lord well with dedication and honor and sacrifice. And I think we need to honor that sacrifice. So lecturing them about that is not very well received. But also, if when people come short term, even though they may have a lot of energy and they may only be there for a short time, I think it's better to join in with the local team and follow the lead of the local team regarding boundaries than it is to come in and defy the local team's boundaries and say, I see that you guys do Sabbath. I'm not going to do Sabbath. I'm going to work because that's what I'm here for. That actually can make the local team look bad, and it really sends a clear message of, is Sabbath something that we really are to observe or not? And in all of this, I hope that we have shown that the management of God-honoring boundaries is an essential spiritual discipline in cross-cultural missions. Just before we start the questions, if anyone is interested in a more extensive handout on this subject, this QR code will take you to a place where it'll take your email and then email you a copy of a longer handout that Medicine has put together. And I think that'll be made available tomorrow also with as this is sent out in video form. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about boundaries, and I wonder what questions we might have.
Thank you. That was a very interesting way of looking at the whole challenge of building boundaries in our life. Many here may not be cross-cultural missionaries like you who spent in a different country. We might be national missionaries working in our own national context. Am I right to assume that these principles are relevant for anybody who needs to be effective and efficient?
Well, it seems to me that the biblical principles are translatable anywhere. Of course, we don't always work in a system that specifically appreciates biblical guidance if we're working in a secular situation. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a principle that every system recognizes won't be able to solve all the problems of boundaries of all the different healthcare organizations. But I think in general, the principles of Sabbath, the principles of that Jesus showed us about having varied priorities and being willing to follow those priorities, to have healing in its proper place, and then our other responsibilities or priorities in their proper place. I think that is something that we can all learn from. Doesn't mean it's always easy. And I think having that sort of help from colleagues to get together and agree together is so important. If one person has those principles and no one else wants to do that, then the boundaries really can be fractious. It can be difficult.
Yeah. So any context, these principles are important, and you need to intentionally set in your systems and processes for that. Thank you. There's a question from one Kamble. As boundaries are biblical, how good can it be for a senior doctor trying to avoid discussions with young ones? I suppose he's asking that the senior doctor is avoiding discussions regarding boundaries. How do you encourage that discussions especially in a senior-junior relationship in a hierarchical situation where seniors may not talk about it?
That within different contexts, that may be difficult to especially address, but I know that there are some organizations who have encountered that situation, and the organizations want their healthcare missionaries to be well taken care of, but there may be some senior clinicians, people in charge, the medical director, who might not be excited about the idea of boundaries. That may interrupt their plans. And some of those organizations are starting to have more open discussions with those facilities, with those medical directors, and express their feelings about how important this concept is and how they really expect their healthcare missionaries to be allowed to have boundaries, mutually supportive boundaries. So there can be some pressure that can come from a supporting organization I don't like to encourage the idea of strikes or anything like that, but I do think that coming together as a group to discuss things with the boss is useful. I embarrassed myself one time and came to my boss in the Navy, and I was very frustrated because I had all of these administrative duties in addition to my clinical work. And when I came to him, I was a little inappropriate really with all the work that I felt like had been pushed on me. And he reminded me, you did sign up for about half of those yourself. So here are the ones that are priorities for me. Be sure that you do those. And the rest of those, I really don't care whether you do them or not. And I realized that much of the issue was my own. So yeah, I think negotiating and maybe with a group a kindly negotiation that it's respectful and entered into with a peaceful and respectful spirit may gain some ground. By the way, I should mention, I intended to mention that surgeon who had a difficult first term. She and her family recognized the importance of boundaries, and so as they were going back to the second term, what they agreed was that she would take every weekend off. She would never work on a weekend. At Friday, would turn over all of her patients by WhatsApp, and she would enter their information and turn those over to the rest of the team. And then she would come back to work on Monday. And that was really tested. There was one point where the chief magistrate's wife was at the hospital and wanted to be seen, but she was able to communicate that she was not available at that time and that this person could either go somewhere else or she'd be very happy to see them on Monday morning. And the person chose to stay, and she saw him on Monday morning. It wasn't a surgical issue, but it worked out just fine. But she said that at the end of the first term, there's no way she would have been able to continue with that sort of a workload. But at least giving herself those weekends, she said, this looks like something that I could do for 20 years.
Thank you. So it highlights the importance of intentionality in both in taking care of self and in communicating that to even your boss or your teams. Thank you for that. There's a long write-up and a question here, but I think highlights quite a few important issues. Let me read that out. Thank you for your presentation. Doctors are almost trained to accept that care they provide comes at a cost to themselves, including accepting high levels of stress, missing out on sleep, and on family life as a result of duty commitments. So there is a question of our own training which prepares us to compromise boundaries. Patients like to see this level of commitment in us, and we ourselves gain, at least at times, satisfaction and increase self-esteem from it. So the patient's expectations and our own satisfaction in burning ourselves out, quote unquote. Why is missionary work still seen as a calling in which even greater personal sacrifices have to be made, when the work itself is often already more challenging as a result of cultural clashes and resource poverty? Very loaded questions with multiple issues.
Yes, and very well worded. That's an
Yes.
excellent question and quite pertinent. So I can't speak to the training and the practice environment around the world. I can say that in the U.S., training and in general expectation there's a medical worldview, and that worldview has its origin in Christian principles, but those principles have been twisted into something that is no longer solidly Christian. So for instance, are we supposed to have a good, solid work ethic? Well, certainly the Bible indicates that we are to work with diligence and work as unto the Lord, and that's great. So we are to be our brother's keeper. We are to love our neighbors as ourselves. But the Bible nowhere says, love your patients more than your family. That's just not a biblical principle. When we are encouraged to sacrifice these other responsibilities, that is going beyond a biblical understanding, and we can expect there to be some pain that comes from that. So certainly we're not only taught a supra-biblical work ethic, we are also taught a supra-biblical level of responsibility for the outcomes of our patients. So that if a patient dies, especially early or young, then that is thought of as someone is ultimately responsible. We are responsible for the life and death of our patients. And I think an important concept we have to understand is, in most of our training, God's sovereignty is not given place at all. If you go to morbidity and mortality conference and you say, well, I feel that this was the Lord's will, that probably won't be well received. But in truth, in our Christian practice, understanding that God is sovereign in the life and death of our patients and being ready to accept that becomes such an important idea, especially in the mission field. If there's often so much death, and so many outcomes that are not what we were looking for, so many uncertainties, that if we're not able to give God's sovereignty its proper place, it really can be crushing. I know of a friend, a pediatrician, who went to a place that was in the middle of a malaria epidemic in one of his first times out, and he was losing 15 children a day. And it was more, he lost more in a day than he had lost during his entire 3-year pediatrics residency. And it was incredibly burdensome to him. But if we are able to recognize, in Deuteronomy 32:39, the Lord says, see now that I am he, and there is no God beside me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is no one who can deliver from my hand. And that is as clear a statement of sovereignty as I can imagine. So if we can begin to live into those statements of sovereignty that the Lord has, it can help us give permission to share some of the load, some of the burden, and realize that it's not all dependent on us, that the Lord actually has it. He's a better physician than we will ever be.
Yeah. I think it's what you brought up is very important. The work ethic, or supra-biblical work ethic, or the Protestant work ethic, really creates a sense of guilt and puts on to God and saying, God will take care of it. I don't need to put in boundaries. And we have a statement: we don't burn out, we burn on. It's God's problem. God will take care of it because we are following God. I think that is a false teaching which you have to come into our own understanding. Thank you for that. Daniel has put up 2 questions. One is, are boundaries only required for life in this current body? Is it possible that Isaiah 40:31 and Philippians 4:13 are true promises for life in the resurrected body at the renewal of all things? And do boundaries remind us that God works even when it is not up to us, through others and the Spirit?
Wonderful questions, as usual, from Dr. O'Neill. I do think that those boundaries can remind us that God is at work through us. From what I said a few minutes ago, it may sound like that I felt that God's sovereignty was the only part in play. I don't believe that that's true. I believe that we also have free will, and there are responsibilities. There are consequences from our actions. I think the Bible is full of both ideas, that God is sovereign and also our actions have consequences, and that we're responsible for those. So it's an important balance that we strike. I think that's kind of part of the narrative dynamic that drives life, especially our professional life. I don't know anyone who's been able to sort that out entirely, but when we are able to get the idea that no, we are responsible, we do have to work with diligence, we are our brother's keeper, and somehow God is sovereign at the same time, when we can try to wrap our minds around that important concept and live that way, it can make a big difference. Dan, I'm not I certainly do not have the theological chops that you have as far as training. And so is Isaiah talking about the new heaven and the new earth? I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that way. I think it refers to hope, that our hope can go on that way rather than our physical endurance. That's the way I interpret those verses. But yeah, I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a related statement and comment from Daniel again. Given the fallout of reduced effectiveness, increased mistakes, and even burnout with those who do not practice boundaries, are these principles really to maximize stewardship, reinforce humility, stay on mission, love our neighbor, and exercise true dependence on God?
I think that's a great question. And it reminds me that moral injury is such a fundamental part of our practice. So moral injury being when someone commits an act, is party to an act, or fails to prevent an act that violates their deeply held moral values. And I think that shows up a lot in medicine, in which we don't intend for there to be a bad outcome, but it happens, and we are involved in the care of that patient, and it can really engender an important sense of guilt. Cross-culturally, that's only magnified because different cultures have different deeply held moral values about the meaning of birth, or meaning birth means, that makes important decisions. So if we're working in a different culture, we're working with people who believe different things, then when an important event happens, as it does in medicine, it's either going to violate my deeply held moral values or their deeply held moral values. So moral injury is a part of it. Happily, we as believers have God-given ways of dealing with that moral injury. So for instance, guilt, confession, and repentance, and accepting the forgiveness that God promises to all of us is such a critical thing. Being able to lament and go to the Lord and cry out to him about the fallenness of the situation, as is found throughout the Bible, is a wonderful spiritual practice and discipline. Sharing our burden with grace-filled, like-minded believers is a wonderful opportunity. Being able to get away, to have Sabbath, to get away from the work and the toxin of moral injury that tends to accumulate, that's important too. And another means is just really working to correct the situation as best we can to try to redeem it. All of those are solidly biblical means of dealing with that moral injury inherent in medicine, especially in cross-cultural medicine, that are so much more powerful for us as believers. And so I think that has something to do with having boundaries, and recognizing that God is in charge. There may be some things that don't happen the way we would like them to, but the Lord even provides means of dealing with that internally and spiritually.
Thank you. One more question from Jennifer. I'm a nurse practitioner. I think Jennifer knows you, an old acquaintance of yours. He's about to embark on a short-term trip.
Wonderful. I do know her. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, conducting clinics, and I think she's asking about how to honor the national medical team there while she's involved in healthcare practice there. So how do you balance both?
Yeah, that's definitely a critical factor, to be able to honor and appreciate the local medical team and the decisions that they've made and the boundaries that they've put into place, even as we move in and come alongside. One of my favorite pieces of advice we had going to the field is, do your best to not try to change anything for 6 months. And really don't try to change anything for 3 months, and absolutely don't try to change anything for 1 month. Go and see how things are done, and the wisdom of the local medical team and what they've been able to do. And then, after a while, especially when they will ask, then you can begin making suggestions and offer some ideas. So I think entering into that situation with a lot of humility at the beginning is so important. And Jennifer is a wonderful soul, and I'm sure that she will excel in that aspect. I can only imagine what she'll be able to contribute. But entering into that situation with a lot of humility and kindness and appreciation of the wisdom of the people who've already been doing the jobs is a good first step. And then after you've seen how it's done, it can be it's good to generally offer some other suggestions. If we're talking about boundaries in particular, I think it's good to negotiate those ahead of time. It's difficult to show up with no boundaries and then try to enter into boundaries. That tends to not be well received, or to be less popular. So entering into that negotiation, especially with the support of the sponsoring organization, may be more successful.
Thank you. I think our time is almost up. I think I just want to end with two things which you shared. I think making ourselves dispensable by building others is very important. in creating boundaries, and boundaries need boundaries. That was a good reminder that boundaries need boundaries. Thank you all for joining. God bless you and see you again. Thank you, Jim, once again for this lovely time together.